Thank you all very much. Can you hear me okay with this? I've got the mobile mic here. Thank you, Dean Rutherford. I'm really excited to be here, but he did miss the most important thing, and that was that Dan Ferriter hired me in 1994, and he was chancellor. And when I interviewed at the University of Arkansas, he told me he would hire no one from the North unless they knew how to call the hogs, which I fortunately passed. Anyway, I would like to just begin by giving you, we are not, in case you're worried, we're not going to just go through data points today. I really want to talk about this partnership and then this team and then the projects that we have going on, because they really truly are exceptional. I'm going to start here with just introducing my friends and the Blair Center team. I'm going to start first with Dr. Pearl Ford Dow. Pearl, would you please stand up? Pearl's an assistant professor at the University of Arkansas Department of Political Science, and she's also a member in the African American Studies program. She focuses all her research on African American political behavior, and she joined us 3 years ago, probably the best thing that I ever did as a department chair. Next, I'd like to introduce to Angie Maxwell. Angie joined us in August formally. Fortunately, we were able to hire her. She went to undergrad at the University of Arkansas, so I've known her for a good long time. She went to the University of Texas where she got her PhD, and we don't hold that against her because she does know how to call the hogs. Her research is very interdisciplinary, and she focuses on Southern identity and Southern history and Southern politics. She's actually also editing 2 books from conferences that we've previously held in conjunction with the Rockefeller Institute. One on C. Vann Woodward, the noted historian who wrote about the civil rights, and then also V.O. Key Jr., and I'm going to come back to him a little bit later. Then last but certainly not least is Dr. Rafael Jimeno. He's our newest member of the Blair Center. His focus is on Latino partisan identities and their political behavior once they immigrate here. He's been a fantastic addition to the program, and I'm just really excited to be a part of this team. There are a lot of institutions that have more research, more resources than the University of Arkansas, but I promise you that there is really no other place that has a diverse and the breadth and depth of a team like this. And I'm really excited about the Rockefeller Institute being willing to support this. We are going to be having some major impact in not only political science and not only the lives of Southerners, but African American studies, Southern studies, and Latino studies. The director of programs at Winthrop Rockefeller Institute, Susan Dumas, has been working feverishly, actually working with us consistently for the past couple of years and working very hard in the last few weeks on this particular event and others, and I'd like her to come and just talk a little bit more about the Rockefeller Institute.
Thank you, Todd. The Winthrop Rockefeller Institute was established in 2005 on beautiful Petit Jean Mountain, which we hear is currently under a blanket of snow, by the way. Our office closed, I think about an hour ago, but we're here, glad to be here. At the Institute, we were actually formed by the University of Arkansas system with a grant from the Winthrop Rockefeller Charitable Trust, which I know many of you are familiar with. Governor Rockefeller was well known across the state to host meetings and conferences. He hosted hundreds during his life at his innovative cattle farm on Petit Jean Mountain. We at the Rockefeller Institute utilize his model to create a climate, a place where we think that real change can happen for the betterment of Arkansas. We too host hundreds of conferences and meetings at the Institute every year. One thing I do want to add though today is a lot of folks still like to call us WinRock. And just sort of a point of reference, that's only natural because we are actually located where WinRock International made their home for about 25 years. But our good friends at WinRock International did actually come down the hill a few years ago, and their home is now here in Little Rock. But if you still call us WinRock, we won't hold it against you. The governor in his 1966 inaugural address dedicated his administration to the state of Arkansas. At the Rockefeller Institute, we too are passionate about the people of Arkansas, and our purpose is to carry out the legacy of Governor Rockefeller. We are so pleased to be in a partnership with the Diane D. Blair Center. Both of us, of course, are part of the University of Arkansas system, and we both have a vision for exploring policy issues through academic research and conferences. In fact, every other year we collaborate and we host an academic conference. Thus far, as Todd mentioned, we've had one on V.O. Key and C. Van Woodward. Those are very exciting to be a part of. We have one planned next year on Rockefeller. And by the way, 2012 will be a great year of celebration for us. It'll have been the 100th birthday for Rockefeller, so that's going to be our big centennial year, and look for stuff on that to be coming up real soon. But when Dr. Shields first approached us about the possibility for being a part of this political survey, something of this magnitude, we said absolutely. We were thrilled to get on board, particularly with the governor's legacy. We knew it was a perfect fit for us to do so. We think, with partisanship all around us, we do think that with the Blair and the Rockefeller names both, each representing different political philosophies, that it adds a great deal of credibility to the poll. But we are so pleased here at the Rockefeller Institute to be a part of this partnership.
Before I introduce our next guest, there's one person that couldn't be here today that I really truly need to thank, and that's Jim Blair. I forgot to give you Dr. Maxwell and Dr. Jimeno's official titles. They're both Diane D. Blair assistant professors. Those are named positions at the University of Arkansas. Jim has continued to be a huge beneficiary of the Diane Blair Center, and his support. He wanted to be here today and he couldn't. And I can tell you that most academics work their entire careers to get a named endowed professor, and once you get that, you've really made it. And it's just a pleasure that we have Angie and Rafael on our team, because they're simply exceptional. But the last and probably one of the most important people on our team that I want to introduce here is Dr. Mike Dennis. He's the Vice President of Knowledge Networks, and he's in charge of government and academic research there. He also has a Texas connection. He got his bachelor's degree and his master's degree from Texas. I don't think he knows how to call the hogs, and I'm working on that with him. So, yeah, okay. Well, I've told him that before he can leave, he has to learn. But he didn't get his PhD at the University of Texas. He went to the University of Chicago, where he finished up there. And I have actually worked with Mike before on a project following the 2004 election. I'm going to come back to that a little bit later, too. Mike.
So I can learn about the hog call at dinner tonight? Is that the plan? So thank you for the very gracious introduction, Todd. I'm very pleased to be here today and delighted to be talking about the poll that's been, I think, going to generate a lot of news interest. I hope it does generate a lot of news interest, and my role today is to explain why the survey is important and also something about the methodology of the research. So I want to talk about a few things first before I get into the methodology, and really talk about why I think this research is noteworthy and deserving of a lot of news coverage and then scholarly attention as the data sets become publicly available. When Professor Shields first brought this study to my attention, brought the study concept to me last summer, it was abundantly clear to me that this study would provide a number of truly valuable insights. And as Todd said, I'm a native Texan, and as a native Texan, I can tell you that I do stay in touch with the folks back home. And looking at what was going on last summer in our country, it was evident to me that the political battles around health care reform, the growing perception that perhaps President Obama was too liberal or moving too far to the left, all these things were putting in jeopardy the historical coalition that put Obama in the White House in the first place, and that also put a House Democratic majority in power. And the heated political rhetoric, actually, for me, was reminiscent of the attacks on President Clinton's own health care reform initiative, as well as the attacks that were made when he increased the marginal tax rate on the wealthy in 1993, immediately prior to the 1994 midterm election. So in that context, I think this survey has a lot to say about our current midterm election that we just went through. So let's talk about why this research is very important. And there's two main things that I want to bring to everyone's attention. The first is that this poll, in my opinion, has captured and put in a measurement capsule, if you will, the attitudes of the citizenry in the period immediately after the historic 2010 midterm election. Now, we can all debate why the election was important, but I don't think there'd be any argument in the room that the election was a very important moment in our country's history. Those feelings, emotions, attitudes, and opinions that helped contribute to the unseating of the Democratic majority, that helped contribute to put in place what we have now as a total of the 29 Republican governors across the country. It was the very mentality of the voters that was measured and recorded by this Blair-Rockefeller poll, and I think that's very important. And these data sets, I think, are going to be valuable not only for the Blair researchers that Todd introduced earlier today, but I think also for many other scholars and other institutions and graduate students who haven't yet written their dissertation plans. They're going to look at these data sets and they're going to use it to try to unpack the puzzle of the 2010 midterm election. The second reason why this poll matters is this. The researchers did not shy away from the notion that regionalism still matters in American politics, that the states making up the Old South, if you will, the former Confederate states, might have their own exceptional and distinguished political attitudes. And taking advantage of the survey infrastructure that my company, Knowledge Networks, provides to scholars, academics, and market researchers as well, the researchers behind the Blair-Rockefeller poll collected a generous number of interviews from the former Confederate states. And that made possible an analysis of regional political differences that still persist today. Also, I think probably lesser important, but also a very important part of the study, there were a number of interviews also collected with other groups to measure attitudes on race, to measure attitudes related to Hispanic ethnicity in this country, obviously a growing group within our society, and interviewing these groups in sufficient numbers to make analyses of these groups, and not only that, but attitudes toward these groups possible. So that'd be a very important set of research objectives for this study. So let's switch gears now and turn to how the study was conducted, which is actually what I'm supposed to be talking about today. And mention that, first of all, it's a large sample. It's 3,400 interviews were done in total for this study. And it has an advantageous sample design because half the interviews were conducted in the former Confederate states and half in the balance of the country, making possible the analysis of regional differences that I mentioned earlier. This split in the number of interviews between the Confederate states and the balance of the country was intentional. It was not an accident. And all the interviews were conducted with people who use computers connected to the internet. So all the survey questions were actually answered by individuals who have internet access using a computer, and they answer these survey questions. Now I need to pause, and I have a special request to make of you. This is a participatory exercise. I'm asked that you, for the moment, forget everything that you believe to be true about internet surveys. And so whatever you think about internet surveys right now, I'd like you just to put it out of your mind, and I'm going to help you try to forget what you think. So I'll be very specific. I ask for you, first of all, to put aside your assumption, it's a very common assumption that people have, that internet surveys are done exclusively by people who are motivated by money. They want to take surveys to make money. I'd like you to put that assumption on the side. Secondly, put aside any perception that you might have that all internet surveys are being done by a tiny minority of people who are staying at home, clicking away, doing all the internet surveys so that pollsters can have survey data. Put aside that perception, if you will. Thirdly, clear your head of any assumptions that internet surveys are done exclusively with people who already have internet access. So 3 out of 10 households still do not have internet access in this country for doing this kind of thing. So put aside that perception. And finally, suspend any assumption that you might have that all internet surveys are inaccurate, unreliable, or somehow not to be used for serious research. Okay, so this is serious research. So your mind now free of misconceptions and misperceptions of internet surveys, this is the point I want to make. The Blair-Rockefeller poll suffers from none of the limitations I just mentioned. To repeat, none of the limitations I just mentioned apply to the Blair-Rockefeller poll. Now, it is indeed true that most internet surveys do suffer from these limitations, but what we've done at Knowledge Networks is we've uniquely solved the problem of how to conduct accurate polls on the internet, and it's not a new thing. We've been doing this for 10 years. So this is what we did in building our knowledge panel, and knowledge panel is the sample source that was used for doing all these interviews for the Blair-Rockefeller Poll. When we built our knowledge panel, the first thing we did was we stayed true to the scientific principles of randomness. We stayed true to traditional principles of random selection of U.S. households. The other internet surveys that are done are based on non-random selection. Second, we actually decided to give computers and free internet access to households that we selected that didn't already have internet access. So 3 out of 10 households were actually equipped with computers and free internet access. That cost a pretty penny. Third, we put in strict limits on how often we survey these households so we don't over-survey them. And fourth and finally, and this is an innovation in the last 2 years, we recognize the trend toward households cutting the cord and getting rid of their traditional residential landline telephone service. So we transitioned from a telephone-based recruitment methodology to using address-based sampling that makes possible the equal sampling of cell phone-only households. Our knowledge panel is now representative of cell phone-only households as well as those households that have traditional landline service. So because of all these things I just mentioned, these design considerations and the investments that we made in building our knowledge panel, we have been the survey research firm selected for hundreds of federally funded surveys in the past 10 years. And the trend's actually going more in the direction of our doing federal work. 2 studies just to mention, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has funded a study that we've been conducting in association with RAND Corporation on the country's preparedness for a possible H1N1 epidemic. Been doing this project for a couple of years. Secondly, the U.S. National Science Foundation has funded the American National Elections Study, dear to all the political scientists on the table on my left, and funding a web panel that we actually conducted for Stanford University and the University of Michigan. 2 signs that online surveys are here and there is a way to do them scientifically that is credible. So because of all these design decisions and investments in survey research, we can state with confidence that this poll, the Blair-Rockefeller Poll, does genuinely measure and accurately measure Southern political attitudes. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it. Thank you. I can honestly say that Knowledge Networks has become the premier place where academics go for accurate data. And we've been remiss in using this. I'm going to go through these slides here quickly. I just want to reiterate a couple things. The survey that we did, we are correctly talking about it as one survey, but it's also correct to think of it as 6 different surveys in one. We've oversampled African Americans in the South and non-South, Hispanics and Latinos in the South and non-South, and Caucasians in the South and non-South. The topics that we've covered are just enormous. There's a sample here. There's no way that I can even come close to telling you all the things that we've covered in this survey. We will be doing articles and books on this for a long time to come. I'm not going to go through point after point. If anyone has questions about these, though, at the end, I'm going to make sure that we leave time for questions and answers, and we'll be happy to answer them if you do. I would like to start, however, like I said, I'm going to give you a background here and tell you why this survey is so important. I don't want to just throw out numbers without a context, okay? I want to start with a question. What does it take to dominate a region? This is the Electoral College map from the 2008 presidential election. And the Republicans had, in the past several elections, owned this L right here. Many people would call it the Republican L, going through the middle of the country, then off to the south. There was sometimes breakups in here, but the South, the Republicans just owned that. It was the backbone of the GOP. Well, in 2008, look, we've got blue, blue, and blue, and political scientists and commentators were like, what is happening here? Is the coalition cracking? What's going on? Well, in 1992, 2 authors' famous book called The Vital South. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. Their provocative conclusion was, as the South goes, so goes the nation. Now, I'll repeat that again. As the South goes, so goes the nation. Why is that? The regions over here in California and Nevada, they are experiencing some demographic changes, some political changes. Most of this area here, and even in the New England area, they are not experiencing a lot of changes. Where's the change happening? Seriously, where is the change happening? All down here. Social, political, economic, educational. As this change happens, the areas that aren't changing are being affected by that. Okay, let me go back. I'm digressing. What does it take to dominate a region? Well, I'm going to give you a little bit of background here. This is for those of you who are not from the South. This is Southern Politics 101 at the 50,000-foot view. Okay? In 1949, V.O. Key Jr. This is the conference that, and the book that Dr. Maxwell is editing, where we had people up at Pettagene Mountain. We asked them, what did Key get right? What did Key get wrong? What is the politics, the Southern politics for the 21st century? By the way, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. Okay? And he had ties to Arkansas, too. I just throw that in there. He's the first one to really start looking at the South and collecting massive amounts of data and saying, what's going on here? Had many provocative conclusions that political scientists and historians are still grappling and struggling with, but reaching the conclusion that what's happening in the South is leading to change. He would never have anticipated, he yearned for a two-party competition in the South. If someone were to tell him, pretty soon the Republicans are going to own the South, he would not have believed you. All right, let's move to step 2. That's step 1, how do you dominate a region? Number 2, how do you dominate a region? All right, this book here, The Emerging Republican Majority. This book was written by Kevin Phillips. It was released in 1969. This right here, this book here was what was released publicly about the Southern strategy. Have you heard about the Southern strategy? Well, I want to back up just a little bit. 1960, who did Richard Nixon run against? Kennedy. Who did the NAACP endorse? Who did Martin Luther King Sr. endorse? Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was the pro-civil rights, the progressive Republican. He was the Rockefeller Republican in 1960. Did he win in 1960? No. He does not win. He comes back in 1968. In the 1968 Republican National Convention, he has massive political arguments with Nelson Rockefeller. Rockefeller argued that the Republican Party's long-term strength was to stay with the urban voter, to stay with African Americans and be pro-civil rights. They expected Nixon to go along with that because in 1960, in his campaigns, he was moved to tears when he said he saw African American children going to different schools and then different races eating in different restaurants. These were things he said in his 1960 campaign. Kevin Phillips and a guy named Harry Dent started collecting massive amounts of data. And I spent enormous amount of time, I'm going to come to this book in a minute, but I spent enormous amount of time on the Nixon material. And in their special documents, they did enormous amounts of polling on the South. It was extremely sophisticated for their time, and I don't know how much they had to spend on all this. I mean, it had to have been a fortune. But there were reams and reams of it, and Kevin Phillips and Harry Dent are telling Nixon, forget what you did in 60, go down south. Now, the famous phrase from Harry Dent is, go hunting where the ducks are. He was trying to say, I really want you to go after Democrats. Now, think about how revolutionary that was. The Democrats owned the South, right? They were the backbone of the segregated, racist South, right? What would a Republican be doing down there? Well, they said, look, we're going to go down to the South and we're going to talk about anti-busing. We're going to talk about states' rights. We're going to change tunes dramatically. Nixon and Kevin Phillips won that argument against Rockefeller, and now the Southern strategy was born, right? Fundamentally, dramatically changed the whole face of both parties and changed the entire coalition in the country, even today. Now, in 2009, I published a book that was talking about the importance of these wedge issues. The Republicans used race as a wedge issue to tell Democrats, hey, your party's not serving you what you want. This is what you want. They exploited that. Well, in the late 1990s and in 2000, Karl Rove was revolutionized wedge issues again. See, in the past, campaigns always went after people who were already voting, right? The idea was, if you're not voting, you're probably not interested. We can't get you interested, right? Karl Rove said, I don't think that that's true. I'm not going to go after what's already on the table. I'm going to go after these people who aren't voting. Now, in 1998 and 1999, not too many people were that concerned about stem cell research. By 2000 and 2004, they were very concerned about stem cell research. These were the so-called 4 million evangelicals that Karl Rove brought into the election in both 2000 and 2004. He redefined what wedge issue was. So let's look at this and say, go back to my question, there are 3 steps to how do you dominate a region. This region is still under conflict. This region is still open for control. I'm not going to be able to hit a lot of things today. There's lots of different ways we could go, but I'm going to hit on 3 main things. Voting and non-voting. This is Karl Rove's genius about what wedge issues are. Second, immigration reform and healthcare reform. And I'm not speaking about immigration and healthcare because I think they are the most important wedge issues. I just picked those because we haven't had a lot of time to look at the data, and these are important. They're in the news right now. They're on your minds, I'm sure. Excuse me. Okay, now if you're a person that looks at charts and goes, whoa, I have no idea what's going on, that's okay. You can just listen to me. Okay? The blue color here are for people who are under 65. If you look at this bar here and here, 25 and 26. Under 65 in the midterm elections split almost evenly, Democrats and Republicans. Now look at the Republican advantage, however, for those that are 65 and older. There's a huge advantage here for Republicans. That advantage becomes even greater when you move over here to this part of the slide. Look at the people who didn't vote. What does these 2 bars tell you? These 2 bars tell you people under 65, over a third of them didn't vote. These are Karl Rove's people that he would be going after. Basically, this bar here says if you were over 65, you voted. This is an enormous advantage for the Republicans, okay? In other words, the Democrats left a lot of votes on the table. Let's look at congressional vote among this is the South, and then broken down by African Americans, Latinos, and Caucasians. Let's look at the Democratic Party here first. This red bar here is African Americans, 50% advantage. The Democratic Party has a huge advantage among African Americans. Look at the Republican Party here. The blue bar going up here is the Caucasians. A huge advantage when it comes to Caucasians. Look here real quickly with Latinos. 18% to 8%. An advantage for the Democrats, yes. Certainly not an enormous advantage like they have with the African Americans. Yet again, let's move over here to the did not vote. Look at this. Democrats left 40% of the African American vote on the table in the 2010 midterm election. These are people who were mobilized in 2008. They were not mobilized in 2010. Look at Latino, 66. Now, Latinos are split, yes they are, but that leans Democratic. Who gets these votes here? This is the question. This right here, Caucasian, as we saw on the previous slide, these are mostly young voters. There's a lot of things that are happening in the South that are still left on the table. All right, I'm going to skip this one just to show you real quick. Non-South is similar. Trust me. I'm going to try to get through to make sure we have time for questions. All right, this is immigration. And we asked people, do you favor immigration reform like the tough laws in Arizona? Okay? We have other questions on immigration too, but this is one that we really wanted to focus out, particularly given the recent news about Arizona. So let's look at, we have South down here on the left and we have the non-South on the right. Look at the Caucasian. Overwhelming support for immigration reform like in Arizona. Look over here at Latinos. Overwhelming opposition to opposition to the immigration like in Arizona. That's not surprising, right? All right, if you're Karl Rove, what are you thinking here? Look at this. Look at African Americans. African Americans in the South, African Americans in the North. What's the greatest percentage of them are saying neither? They don't support it or they don't oppose it. African Americans, in other words, they haven't yet made up their mind about this. This is a huge wedge issue. One of the things that we're going to come back to over and over, and I'd hope some of you ask my team here some questions about how African Americans are viewing Latinos and how Latinos are viewing African Americans, because I'm telling you right now, who captures those votes shapes national politics and regional politics for the next 50 years. It's just a reality. If African Americans and Latinos vote together democratically, we see the return of the Democratic South. If Republicans are able to capture the Latino vote, then they continue to maintain control of the South. It's as fundamental as that. Next one. All right, healthcare reform. I'm just quickly moving there. Again, I'm going to go quickly with Caucasians, absolutely opposed to healthcare reform. African Americans, supportive of healthcare reform. True in the South and true in the non-South. Look at Latinos, though. What's their greatest percentage? Just like African Americans and immigration, Latinos are saying, you know, hey, when it comes to healthcare, not really sure. That's really surprising. This is a group of people that I really would have thought would have said, I'm all for this, right? This is a group of people that the Republicans and the Democrats will be trying to convince about health care. Which way they go is going to have a fundamental effect on what happens in 2012. All right, 2012 presidential election. Let me ask this question. How would Hillary Clinton or Mike Huckabee win the presidency? Okay? Based upon this big overview that I've given you, there are a couple things that I really want to emphasize. Number one, voter mobilization is key. It wasn't too long ago that women didn't have the right to vote. Then they did, and parties went after. It wasn't so long ago African Americans didn't have the right to vote. When they did, parties went after them. They fought over that coalition. 18 to 21-year-olds fighting over that coalition. Latinos will be the next. Younger people will be the next. Who reaches younger voters? That's going to be, right now, the baby boom generation is voting and they are dominating electoral politics. That's not going to continue. People are going to have to reach out. Which party gets them? That's going to be the question. Another question, do Latinos support health care reform? Do African Americans support tougher immigration laws? Which party convinces these two groups their right will become the new majority? Ultimately, which party is strategic enough to know that the South has been and will continue to be what leads the country? So let me go back to this question. How would they win? Or maybe even, would you like us to predict who will win? Well, like a typical academic, I'm going to pull my punches when it comes to actual prediction. But I am going to promote something that we're doing in October. Am I right, Susan? In October, are we up on the mountain in October? We are up on the mountain in October. We are having a conference where we will, by this time, have had plenty of time to review this data. We're going to be bringing in strategists from the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. We're going to be bringing in scholars that are writing with the Blair team and others. And we are going to, at that point, right before the 2012 presidential primary season really kicks off, we will be going out on a limb and making some forecasts then. Okay? At this point, I did a good job. Dean Rutherford may actually invite us back because I ended on time. I want to open up for any questions that you may have. Is there a microphone, by the way? Go ahead. Somebody be bold. Be the first. Right here's one.
Excuse me.
You know what? I can hear you fine, but they need you the mic for the TV.
Just looking at the bar graphs, it didn't look like there was significant difference between the southern region and the rest of the country.
Very good point. Increasingly, we're finding that the southern region, in many different ways, looks like the non-southern region. There are some findings, and actually Dr. Maxwell might want to talk about these more, but there are some religious differences in the South and the non-South, where the South has a much greater percentage of Baptists than the rest of the country. We still believe that the South is the region of change, but you're exactly right. Increasingly, they're looking similar. Great question. There's one in the very back.
Thank you, Dean Shields, and the team for great research. My question deals a bit more with the Latino population. you read a lot in the news about demographically how the sheer numbers of Latino population is probably the fastest growing demographic. And I know the bar graph showed, the three, Caucasian, African American, and Latino, but it seems like the Latino population is the fastest growing, and consequently, do you all feel, I guess, that the demographic research for the next 10, 15 years in the South specifically will be driven more by and influenced by Latino population of the three?
I'm going to be a good administrator and defer to someone more intelligent than I am.
Is this on? Yes.
Yeah. Can you see him, or would you like him to stand up? Go ahead, stand up, Doctor.
I would say that you're probably correct. I mean, by census estimates, it'll be 2050 when Latinos become a fourth of the U.S. population. The reason that we have to be a little bit more cautious in assuming that they'll have a significant impact politically is that there's a large percentage of them that are unincorporated, right, who fail to attain citizenship or who are not eligible for citizenship. And so even though their numbers increase, it doesn't always translate into political power as it should.
I have a question down here, too.
Thank you, Dean Shields. This is a fascinating study. And early in the presentation, you talked about how there was an oversampling of African Americans in this study, both Southern and non-Southern African Americans. So I think this question would go for Dr. Dow. Did you find any distinctions between attitudes of race or racism between African Americans in the South versus African Americans in other parts of the country?
Actually, no. African Americans throughout the country consistently share this very similar opinions about their experiences, liberal expression on issues, and so there is some consistency there. Where there is a difference is in perception of life and quality of life. We asked the question about, do you feel that you have the same opportunity as whites? And African Americans in the non-South, over 65% of them said they did not, in comparison to 58% within the South. And even the question about how do you view your life, are you satisfied with your life? We have more African Americans in the South that are satisfied. And so we probably can say that most likely it's going to be contributed to the economic climate, particularly African Americans and the extremely high number, over 20% African Americans that are unemployed nationwide. And in some of these states, industrial states, African American employment rates are almost as high as 25%.
Well, I'll just reiterate something that Dr. Dow just said, is that African Americans were more likely to consider themselves Southern than Southern Caucasians, and they had a more optimistic view of the future if African Americans were from the South. But overall, we're finding that the regional differences are not as expansive as they once were. We think that's a really good thing, but there are definitely differences still. Yeah, Julie.
Hi, my name is Julie Meyer. I'm a student here at the Clinton School, and my question is regarding particularly the Latino population that answered the poll. Is there a way of knowing if they are citizens or not, and if so, does that affect their responses?
Dr. Jimeno, you want to take that too?
Actually, yeah. There is a question about their citizenship status, and there is enough in both subgroups to do some interesting comparisons about their behaviors. We also have a significant number of not naturalized Latinos, but native-born Latinos, so citizenship off the bat.
Great. There's some couple questions in the back.
Again, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Do you see unsophisticated voters catching on to wedge issues and being a little bit more aware that sometimes they end up voting in against their own self-interest, or will they not catch on?
Let me just respond to that real quickly, but then I'll let Dr. Maxwell or tell me where I'm wrong, okay? One of the things that I would have said before Karl Rove's strategy was that unsophisticated voters, in all honesty, we did not think they would catch on, that they would understand what was going on, or they could be pulled into the political scientists at the time. We thought if you're voting, you're going to vote. The biggest predictor of your participating in the next election is whether or not you participated in the last one. And it was the assumption that if you weren't a non-voter, it took an enormous amount of touches and contacts and effort and callings and mailing to get you out, and you may never show up. Karl Rove showed that if he can get issues to people and through institutions, like the churches, which by the way, African Americans and Latinos have those same type organizations available to either political party should they choose to go after that, with particular issues for them. They, rural and uneducated and people who hadn't participated in a long time came out in droves, and they were new voters. Dr. Maxwell, do you want to tell me if I'm wrong or comment on that at all?
I think you're right.
Okay.